Good morning and welcome. My name is Natasha Carver and I am in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and I'm also a member of Migration Mobilities Bristol. And today I am talking to Esther Dermott. Hello, Esther.
Hello, hi.
Hi. So Esther is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Bristol in the School for Policy Studies, and she was recently accepted into the Academy of Social Sciences. She is very well known for her work on families, on parenting, on intimacy and poverty, and especially for her work on fathers and fathering. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Esther, thank you so much for joining us. You've recently been involved in a project on Syrian refugee fathers. Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yes, so the project's called Being a Refugee and Being a Father. It was funded by the British Academy, small grant, led by Tina Miller at Oxford Brookes University with me, a researcher, Ziad Gandor, and also it was a comparative project. So it involved Therese Viso at Gothenburg in Sweden. And it does what it was kind of says on the tin, really. We were trying to explore the experiences of being a Syrian refugee father in those two locations, UK and Sweden, given the large numbers of refugees that had come to the UK and Sweden from Syria in the aftermath of the war, the relatively recent war. And we had a sense, we came at it as because we're all fatherhood researchers. So we were really interested in trying to understand fathers who were trying to be good fathers, however you want to think about that, in really challenging, difficult circumstances and in very different circumstances that they wouldn't perhaps have chosen themselves. So we were interested in expanding the ideas of fatherhood, but obviously it also talks to, hopefully, or kind of confirms some other pieces of research around migration as well.
So when you're looking at, with this slant, this angle on fathers, is it because there's a kind of gendered presumption in political and media discourses that a male migrant, perhaps especially sort of asylum-seeking men, are single, or that even if they are fathers, it's just kind of irrelevant to what's going on? Is that where you kind of started from?
Yes, that makes sense. So lots of as you'll know, lots of the images of migrant men coming to the UK were young men, and the idea that they had no dependents and were economic migrants, had no other kind of familial connections. Of course, that can be challenged very strongly as well. But we were interested in the stories of fathers because they just seemed completely absent. And perhaps in contrast, mothers and their children were talked about in some of the policy framings around migration. Being a mother and having dependent children was certainly a marker of vulnerability that might mean that you should be prioritised and supported in coming to the UK. But fathers, so fathers seemed really largely absent.
And was that a discourse that the fathers themselves, acknowledged or saw as a problem? Did they raise that with you?
I don't think the fathers themselves were so aware of that. Okay. So that was something that we looked at and could see in the policy discussions. And maybe the way that it played out in the fathers' lives was that they felt that they didn't see how any support mechanisms or interventions were geared towards what they wanted to do as men. So they weren't talking about the discourses themselves. They weren't reading necessarily those kind of documents, but there was a lot of focus on, they were aware there's a lot of focus on children and how you should kind of parent properly. But they felt that they were doing a lot of that work, but perhaps left out of some of the conversations.
And these were fathers who had their children with them in the UK and in Sweden, or were some of them were absent parents as well?
So they all had children with them, but they didn't all have children with them for the whole time that they'd been a refugee. So some of them had travelled independently to the UK through lots of different routes, and then through family reunification had got their wives and children there. Some of them had been in some of the camps that were set up and through the vulnerable Syrian refugee resettlement program had been allowed to move. Often those were families where children perhaps had some significant medical problems, where they'd been prioritised in the UK schemes. The Swedish situation was a little bit different. So interestingly, in Sweden, it had been sometimes mothers who had moved first, and then some fathers. So the patterns of the profiles in which people had come to the UK did vary a little bit, but all of the fathers had children with them at the time when we were speaking to them.
And were there other differences that you found between Sweden and the UK?
Yeah, there were quite a lot. So one of the key ones was language. So in Sweden, there was a big priority on anybody who comes to Sweden getting free language training and kind of working up their kind of language. So that, although that was an initial issue for men in Sweden, it became less of an issue because they were learning Swedish and that was kind of standard. Whereas in the UK, the English language barrier was a really big issue for the men who didn't have English before they came. So we had people who had very different employment and educational experiences in Syria, from those who were very professional educated, had and often did have some English, who had a much easier time of it in terms of integrating, to use a contentious term, but engaging in employment or doing other things, to those whose English language was much more limited, and who perhaps their skills and backgrounds. For example, somebody who dyed clothes in Syria, it didn't translate it very easily into a UK employment labour market. Yeah. And getting a job, and I'm emphasising labour markets because getting a job for these men was the main thing that they really wanted to do in order to, as an aspect of being the father that they wanted to do and being a man in society.
And on the back of your research, have you got any kind of policy recommendations that or that you could suggest that we might need to think about in order to make things easier for people to resettle?
Well, there's a few things, and I'm not sure that the things that we're actually saying on this are necessarily new, and they probably echo some of the discussions that are taking part in other locations as well. But one of them is the really importance of community, so that for their families who were able to relocate where there were other Syrian families, or whether there were other kind of networks of people who spoke the same languages or could kind of integrate them into society. So actually, some of the families who came to London, even though that was kind of big and diverse, had an easier time of it than those who were relocated to more rural locations in the north of England. So just a community and other people are really important for passing on knowledge, but lots of that kind of tacit information and offering support. So I think that's probably important for maybe what we might be seeing kind of in another wave of refugee and kind of migration in the near future. That's really important. And perhaps the other thing is thinking about fathers and mothers as needing perhaps different kinds of support. So many of them, although we spoke to the fathers, a lot of the mothers spoke much more positively about their experiences, that they kind of were enjoying some of the new opportunities that they had. And again, many of the children, by the time we spoke to them for a second time, were spending time in school, spoke English well, kind of engaged with sport and so on. And it was the men who were felt in some ways, in some cases, left behind. So there was one father we spoke to who said, I've left a prison, I've just come to another prison. It's a prison without walls, but actually I can't do anything. I can't really live here. So I think that's really important. And maybe the other thing, which is not a direct policy intervention as such, but it's just that sense, the importance of understanding the depth of trauma that these fathers and their families had been through and were having to try and manage and deal with, and how that just makes everything more difficult. So that bureaucracy, the everyday bureaucracy that we see in the UK, but expect people to manage, paperwork, credit benefit systems, health systems, education systems, it's difficult enough anyway, let alone if you don't speak the language, let alone if you've had really hugely difficult circumstances to then kind of put the energy into trying to navigate some of those things. So I've said quite a few things. Maybe there's one other thing, which is around that issue of bureaucracy. And again, I know other researchers have talked about this as well. But just our systems, when you see this, our systems in the UK that maybe not make sense, but you know how to work them whenever you've lived there for a really long time. If you're coming in as an external person, things that we take for granted just aren't very obvious. So for a big thing that came up was health appointments, so that if fathers just couldn't understand why if they turned up 15 minutes late for a health appointment, having perhaps traveled for an hour or so, they wouldn't be seen because they were late. So time was just thought of differently. The fact that it was really important to get your children to school at 8:30 every morning, and you had to be there at time, and you had to pick your children up after school. What was this kind of managing of children and being around, rather than children either being able to navigate this themselves, or they're just being a kind of a bigger community of people who do that research. And I know that links into some of the findings from some of your previous research as well.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear you talk about the differences between men and women, because obviously that's a big finding from my research, in the sense that if a woman comes with children and she is constructed her identity as a mother, then you carry on being a mother, whereas often fathers' identities are very much bound up with fathering is obviously an element of that, but it might be being a breadwinner is the most important aspect of being a father. And if you can't get a job, then obviously that's really challenging for you to reconstruct your identity. But I was also really interested there about what you were saying about the bureaucracy, because it seems to me that that's also about the hostile environment, in a sense. So we've got an official policy of the hostile environment to make it difficult for asylum seekers and migrants, to come and to remain in the country. But in a sense, I hadn't really thought previously about our everyday systems as being hostile too, if you're not kind of in the know, if you don't know how to navigate them. So I think that's a really interesting dimension.
Yeah, I agree. And how do you find ways to mediate those, or who are the important individuals? So again, it's going back to that sense of community in a very broad sense. Another example that seemed to work well was a number of Syrian refugees had come through a system where local churches could sponsor Syrian refugees. And so even though the people in those churches were a different religion, different background, didn't have the same kind of language necessarily, there was a community there of people who were willing and able to navigate and support and take the time to help families with some of those kind of connections. And that really made a difference. And maybe we're just such a society that is so formalized around navigating any forms of benefits and support that we don't put those in place. But maybe one of the other things about this project is trying to highlight not just the high level, as you talk about hostility and kind of policy systems, but also how those can be managed and are navigated around, or can kind of be challenged, or could be shifted even in ways that don't change the kind of the highest level policy initiatives.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been really interesting to hear more about your work, and I look forward to reading more about it when it's published.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.